Serafina in the Black Cloak, chapter 29, starting on page 272 at the bottom. So you were stuck in your lion form, Serafina said in amazement. Yes, Leandra said, her voice ragged. I became sick with grief. I couldn't find your father, feared that he was dead. My soul, my body, my love, they had all been torn apart, shredded to pieces. I did not want to live. Her mother's voice faltered from a whisper to nothing at all. But Serafina moved closer to her. But you were pregnant, she said, urging her to continue. That's right, her mother said, lifting her head. I was pregnant. It was the only thing that kept me going. I gave birth a few months later, but it was not as it should have been. You were the only one of my 4 children to survive, and I did not know if you would make it through the night. And what was I to do from there? You were human and I was not. How could I care for a human baby? What happened next? Serafina pleaded. That same night, I heard the steps of a man walking through the forest, her mother said. Thinking him an enemy, I almost killed him. I circled the stranger in the darkness, watched for him to come up for a long time, trying to look into his heart. Was he a good man? Was there strength in him or weakness? Would he defend his den with tooth and claw? This was not your true father, but he was a human being, and he was the only choice I had. I made the decision to let him take my baby. I prayed that he would carry you into the human world and make sure that someone took care of you. For though it broke my heart, I knew that I could not. That was my Paul, Serafina cried out. Leandra smiled and nodded. That was your Paul. You were curled into a ball and so covered in blood that I barely got a good look at you that night. I honestly didn't know whether you would even survive, Serafina. And if you did, I worried that you would be terribly deformed. I had no idea whether you would come out normal. Serafina went very quiet. And then she lifted her eyes and looked at her mother. In the frailest of voices, she asked, Did I? Her mother's face burst with joy, and she threw her arms around her and laughed. Of course you did, Serafina. You're beautiful. You're perfect. Look at you. My God, I've never seen a girl so lovely and perfect in all my life. That night when you were born, I thought that man might take one look at you and drown you in a bucket like an unwanted goat. I had so many crazy, dreadful worries, but here you are. You're alive, and you're perfect in every way. When Serafina looked up at the sky, the stars were all glimmering and splotchy as she wiped her tears from her eyes. It felt like her heart was overflowing. She reached out her arms and hugged her mother. She wrapped her arms tightly around her, feeling her warmth and her strength and her joy and her happiness. And her mother held her close, almost purring, and tears fell from their cheeks, and the little cubs, Serafina's half-brother and half-sister, tumbled around their feet, joining in the family reunion. I can see that your Paul raised you well, Serafina, her mother said, separating them a little bit and looking into her face. When I saw you the first time here in the cemetery, I thought you were an intruder, and I attacked out of pure instinct. After 12 years, I was far more animal than I was anything else. It wasn't until tonight, when I saw your eyes up close, that I slowly began to realize who you were. And now here you are. And you freed me, Serafina. After 12 years, you have healed my soul. Do you realize that? I am whole again because of you. I have arms, I have hands, I can laugh, I can kiss you. You saved me. And just look at you. You're the most perfect kitten I could have ever hoped for. You're fierce of heart and sharp of claw and fast and beautiful. Serafina's cheeks burned with heat, and her heart filled with pride. But when she looked at the children waiting for her, it was the black cloak that did all this, she said. Yes, her mother looked around at their confused and frightened faces as they huddled together among the graves. They don't seem to know what happened to them. But you do, Serafina said, looking at her mother. She nodded. Only half of my soul was in the black cloak. That must have been awful, Serafina said, trying to imagine it. But why were all of his most recent victims children? Mr. Thorne lived in this area for many years, avoiding detection by only capturing a soul ever so often when he spotted a particular talent he wanted, her mother said. But then something happened and the cloak began to take its toll on him. His body was aging severely every day. He was dying. The skin and the gloves, Serafina gasped. He started stealing the souls of children, not just because they had the talents he wanted, but because they had the one thing he most desperately needed. They were young, Serafina said. But how did you learn all this? Her mother stood and brought Serafina to her feet with her. There is much for us to talk about, Serafina, she said, but we need to get these children home to their parents. But, Serafina said, she wanted to keep talking, wanted to know more, and she was terribly scared that something would take her mother away from her again. Don't worry, her mother said, touching Serafina's face gently with her hand. This isn't a fleeting run. I'm here now and I'm whole again. In the days ahead, I will begin to teach you all that I can, just as a mother should. And you will tell me all about your life, too, to help me come back to the human world that I have been absent from for so long. We are together now, Serafina. We are family and kin, and nothing shall ever break that bond between us again. Tears streamed down her mother's cheeks. More than anything right now, I just want you to know how much I love you. I love you, Serafina, and I have always loved you. I love you too, Mama, she said, her voice crackling as she wrapped her arms around her and wept in her mother's arms. Chapter 30. Serafina stood in the cover of the trees at the edge of the forest and looked toward Biltmore Estate. The sun was just rising in a clear blue sky, casting a golden light on the front walls of the mansion. A large group of men and women on foot and on horseback were gathering together. There were ladies and gentlemen, servants and workmen, and there was an urgency in their movements. They're organizing a search, Serafina thought. Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt stood among them, their faces troubled with the news of yet another missing child. Mrs. Brahms stood with her husband, who was dressed in a rugged clothing and ready to trek into the forest. Mr. Rosanov was there as well, holding his daughter's dog in his arms. Even the young maid and the footman, Miss Whitney and Mr. Pratt, had come out to help, along with the chief cook, the butler, his assistant boy, and many of the other household servants and men from the stables. If we're going to find her, we have to move quickly, Braden shouted as he mounted his horse in one swift, confident movement. Serafina's heart swelled when she saw him. That's when she realized what she was seeing. Braden had organized the search. They were going out into the forest to search for her. Everyone, please gather around, Braden called from atop his horse. She had never seen him so bold, so filled with leadership and determination. Rich or poor, guest or servant, he had brought them all together. It sent a wave of warmth through her cold, tired body. Then she saw her pa. He must have woke up in the morning and discovered she was gone. Overcoming his fear of discovery, he went to the Vanderbilts for help, even though he knew it would expose her existence and betray the fact that they were living in the basement. Braden turned and gestured to the dog handlers. Give them this, he said as he tossed a piece of clothing to the lead handler. It was her old shirt dress. The 4 brindled plot hounds bayed like it was a coon hunt. I looked for Mr. Thorne so he could join us in the search, Mr. Bindle said from atop his thoroughbred, but I couldn't find him anywhere. And you're not going to, Serafina thought with satisfaction as she watched the search party gather. Ever. Mr. Bindle, if you would, please take that group there and go east, Braden said. Uncle, perhaps you could take your footman and go west. Braden turned to the dog handlers. When I put Gideon on Serafina's scent, he ran straight north, so that's where we'll try to pick up her trail. Braden turned in his saddle and pointed in that direction, and there he stopped. At that moment, when Serafina knew Braden would see her, she stepped out of the woods. Unsure of what he was seeing at first, Braden lifted his reins, pivoted his horse, looked out across the lawn toward the trees. His eyes found her, and a smile spread across his face. She could see his relief and happiness. "Who is that?" Mr. Vanderbilt asked in confusion. "Is that the girl we're looking for?" Mrs. Vanderbilt asked. Everyone turned toward Serafina and looked at her as she stood at the edge of the forest in her torn gown. Today she wasn't hiding. For the first time in her life, she was being truly seen by everyone. She stood there and just waited for them to understand what they were seeing. There was amazement in their expression, not just from the presence of a lone girl standing at the edge of the woods, but also because of what stood beside her, a large, full-grown mountain lion. Serafina's bare hand lay on the lioness' neck, touching the animal, holding her. The mountain lion wasn't just there, but with her, strong and silent at her side. On the other side stood a black Doberman, Gideon. The dog's shoulder was gashed and red with blood, but he stood strong and proud with the knowledge that he had fought his battle and won. Braden smiled. "I knew you'd find her, boy," he said under his breath. When a young lad in a coachman's jacket stepped out of the woods and stood beside Serafina, expressions of surprise and disbelief and happiness spread across the faces of the search party. Then a young blonde girl came out, then several more children, and soon a whole group of children stood with her and her two animal companions at the edge of the forest.